Welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Horrors, where we explore the most chilling true crime stories that have shaped our world. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into the darkness that lurks in human nature. Today's story is particularly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we begin, I want to remind you that this channel is dedicated to understanding these cases from a psychological and investigative perspective, always keeping the victims and their families in our thoughts. If you find value in our detailed analysis of these cases, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it with others who appreciate true crime content. In the annals of criminal history, certain names become synonymous with unthinkable horror. While the world knows of infamous killers like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, Poland harbors its own dark chapter in the form of Leszek Pekalski. Known as one of the most brutal serial killers in Polish history, Pekalski's crimes shocked a nation and left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of an entire generation. This is the story of a man whose descent into darkness would claim multiple innocent lives and forever change how Poland viewed safety within its own borders. Born in 1966, Leszek Pekalski would grow up to become a name whispered in fear, a cautionary tale that parents would use to warn their children about strangers. His crimes, committed in the early 1990s, were marked by a level of brutality that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who followed the case. But to understand the monster, we must first examine the man and the circumstances that would shape one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern Polish history. So settle in for what will be a comprehensive examination of one of Europe's most notorious killers. And remember, if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Let's begin our journey into the mind of Leszek Pekalski. Leszek Pekalski was born into a Poland that was undergoing dramatic transformation. The year 1966 marked a time when the country was still firmly under communist rule, struggling with economic hardships and social upheaval that would define much of his early life. Born in the small town of Byto in northern Poland, Pekalski's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction that would later be scrutinized by psychologists and criminologists, attempting to understand the genesis of his violent tendencies. His family life was turbulent from the very beginning. His father was largely absent, both physically and emotionally, leaving young Leszek to be raised primarily by his mother in an environment characterized by poverty and neglect. Those who knew the family during this period would later describe a household where basic emotional needs went unmet, where discipline was either completely absent or explosively violent, and where the young boy learned early that the world was a harsh, unforgiving place. As a child, Pekalski displayed many of the warning signs that criminologists now recognize as potential indicators of future violent behavior. He was known to torture small animals, a behavior that began when he was barely old enough to walk. Neighbors would occasionally find dead cats or birds that had been mutilated in ways that suggested deliberate cruelty rather than childish curiosity gone wrong. When confronted about these incidents, young Leszek would either deny involvement completely or show a disturbing lack of remorse that unnerved the adults in his life. School proved to be another arena where his problematic behavior manifested. Teachers described him as an intelligent child who nevertheless struggled to form meaningful relationships with his peers. He was often involved in fights, not the typical schoolyard scuffles that most children engage in, but vicious encounters where he seemed to take genuine pleasure in inflicting pain on others. His academic performance was inconsistent, marked by periods of intense focus followed by complete disengagement that suggested deeper psychological issues were at play. The political climate of Poland during Pekalski's formative years cannot be overlooked as a contributing factor to his development. The 1970s and early 1980s were marked by economic crisis, political repression, and social unrest that created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear throughout the country. The imposition of martial law in 1981, when Pekalski was 15 years old, meant that he came of age in a society where violence and authoritarianism were normalized aspects of daily life. During his teenage years, Pekalski's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He was known to disappear for days at a time, returning home dirty and disheveled with no explanation of where he had been or what he had been doing. His mother, overwhelmed by her own struggles and lacking the resources to seek professional help, largely ignored these warning signs. In a society where mental health services were practically non-existent, and where admitting to family problems could have serious political ramifications, many parents found themselves ill-equipped to deal with troubled children. It was during this period that Pekalski first came to the attention of local law enforcement, though not yet for the crimes that would later make him infamous. He was caught stealing on multiple occasions, progressing from small items like food or cigarettes to more valuable goods that required planning and premeditation to acquire. Each arrest seemed to embolden rather than deter him, as if he were testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. By the time he reached adulthood, Pekalski had developed into a young man who seemed to exist on the fringes of society. He had no steady employment, no close relationships, and no apparent goals or ambitions beyond immediate gratification. Those who encountered him during this period would later describe him as having an unsettling presence, something indefinable that made people uncomfortable in his company. He had mastered the art of appearing normal when necessary, but there was always something lurking beneath the surface that suggested danger. The fall of communism in 1989 brought traumatic changes to Poland, but for Pekalski, the transition seemed to exacerbate rather than improve his situation. The economic chaos that accompanied the shift to a market economy left many people struggling to survive, but it also created opportunities for those willing to exploit the confusion and desperation of others. It was in this environment of uncertainty and social upheaval that Pekalski would begin the crime spree that would earn him a place in the darkest chapters of Polish criminal history. The early 1990s saw Pekalski drifting from place to place, taking odd jobs when necessary, but never committing to anything long-term. He lived in a series of rundown apartments and boarding houses, keeping to himself and avoiding the kind of social connections that might have provided stability or intervention. To his neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared to be just another casualty of the economic transformation, one of many young men struggling to find their place in a rapidly changing world. But beneath this facade of ordinary desperation, something far more sinister was developing. Pekalski had begun to fantasize about violence in ways that went far beyond the casual cruelty of his youth. He spent hours planning elaborate scenarios involving the capture, torture, and murder of victims who existed only in his imagination. These fantasies became increasingly detailed and realistic, serving as a rehearsal for the horrors he would eventually inflict on real people. The progression from fantasy to action is a well-documented phenomenon in the study of serial killers, and Pekalski's case would prove to be a textbook example of this escalation. The barriers that prevent most people from acting on violent impulses seem to be completely absent in his psychological makeup, leaving him free to pursue his darkest desires without the constraints of conscience or empathy that govern normal human behavior. As 1991 drew to a close, Leszek Pekalski stood on the threshold of a transformation that would forever alter his life and the lives of his future victims. The young man who had shown early warning signs of violent tendencies was about to become something far worse than anyone in his orbit could have imagined. The stage was set for a series of crimes that would shock Poland and establish Pekalski as one of the most notorious killers in the nation's history. The winter of 1991 marked the beginning of what would later be recognized as one of the most horrifying crime sprees in Polish history. Leszek Pekalski, now 25 years old, had crossed the invisible line that separates those who merely fantasize about violence from those who act upon their darkest impulses. His first confirmed victim would be discovered in circumstances so brutal that even experienced police officers would struggle to process what they encountered. The discovery came on a cold February morning when a group of children playing in a wooded area outside Baito stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Partially hidden beneath a pile of snow and debris was the body of a young woman, her remains showing evidence of prolonged torture before death. The condition of the corpse suggested that the killer had taken considerable time with his victim, inflicting pain and suffering that served no purpose beyond the perpetrator's own twisted gratification. Local police, unaccustomed to dealing with crimes of such severity, initially struggled to comprehend what they were investigating. The post-communist Polish law enforcement system was still adapting to new procedures and technologies, and many officers lacked the training necessary to handle complex criminal investigations. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately, as curious onlookers and inexperienced personnel trampled through evidence that might have provided crucial leads. Despite these initial setbacks, certain details about the crime began to emerge that would later prove significant in establishing Pekalski's modus operandi. The victim had been bound with rope in a manner that suggested the killer possessed knowledge of restraint techniques that went beyond simple improvisation. The torture appeared to have been systematic rather than random, indicating a level of planning and premeditation that distinguished this crime from typical acts of passion or desperation. What perhaps most disturbed the investigators was the evidence suggesting that the killer had remained with the victim for an extended period after death. Personal items had been arranged in ritualistic patterns around the body, and there were signs that the perpetrator had returned to the scene multiple times, possibly to relive the experience or to add elements to his grotesque tableau. This behavior suggested a level of psychological dysfunction that went beyond mere criminality into the realm of severe mental pathology. The investigation into this first murder would drag on for months without producing any significant leads. Pekalski had been careful to avoid leaving obvious evidence, and his lack of any clear connection to the victim made it difficult for police to identify him as a suspect. Meanwhile, he was already planning his next attack, emboldened by his success in evading detection and eager to refine the techniques he had used in his inaugural killing. His second confirmed victim was a teenage boy who disappeared while walking home from school in late spring of 1992. The boy's disappearance initially generated less attention than it might have under different circumstances, as runaway children were not uncommon in the economic chaos of post-communist Poland. Many families were struggling to survive, and it was not unusual for young people to leave home in search of better opportunities elsewhere. When the boy's remains were discovered several weeks later, it became clear that this was no ordinary missing person case. The body showed signs of the same systematic torture that had characterized the first murder, but with refinements that suggested the killer was learning and evolving his methods. The restraints were more sophisticated, the torture more prolonged, and the ritualistic elements more elaborate. Most disturbing of all, there was evidence that the victim had been kept alive for several days, during which time he had been subjected to unimaginable suffering. The similarities between the two crimes were too significant to ignore, and police began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer. This recognition brought additional resources to the investigation, including consultation with experts in criminal psychology who had studied similar cases in other countries. However, the lack of advanced forensic techniques and the contaminated crime scenes made it extremely difficult to develop actionable leads. Pekalski, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly bold in his activities. The success of his first two murders had convinced him that he was smarter than the police and that he could continue killing without being caught. He began to stalk potential victims more openly, spending days or even weeks observing their routines and identifying the best opportunities to strike. His confidence was growing, but so was his appetite for violence. The third murder, committed in the summer of 1992, marked a significant escalation in the brutality of Pekalski's crimes. The victim was a young mother who had been abducted while shopping for groceries in broad daylight. Witnesses reported seeing a man approach her in the parking lot of a local store, but their descriptions were vague and contradictory. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, both the woman and her attacker had vanished. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The scene was so horrific that several police officers required psychological counseling after processing it. The victim had been subjected to torture that exceeded anything seen in the previous cases, with evidence suggesting that Pekalski had spent considerable time perfecting new methods of inflicting pain. The ritualistic elements had also become more elaborate, indicating a deepening psychological investment in his crimes. What made this case particularly tragic was the discovery that the victim had been pregnant, a fact that seemed to have provided additional motivation for the killer, rather than serving as a deterrent. The evidence suggested that Pekalski had been aware of the pregnancy and had incorporated this knowledge into his torture routine in ways that demonstrated a level of evil that defied comprehension. The public reaction to this third murder was immediate and intense. The media, newly freed from communist censorship restrictions, covered the story extensively, and public fear reached unprecedented levels. Parents began keeping their children inside. Women traveled in groups, and many people simply avoided going out after dark. The entire region seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the killer to strike again. Police pressure intensified dramatically following the third murder. Additional investigators were assigned to the case, including specialists from Warsaw, who brought more advanced investigative techniques to bear on the evidence. A task force was established with the sole purpose of catching the killer, and rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. Despite these efforts, Pekalski remained frustratingly elusive. Part of his success in avoiding detection stemmed from his ability to appear completely normal when interacting with others. Neighbors and acquaintances would later express shock upon learning of his crimes, describing him as quiet and unremarkable, but not particularly suspicious. He had mastered the art of blending into the background, of being forgettable in a way that served his purposes perfectly. The fourth murder, committed in early autumn of 1992, would prove to be different from the previous crimes in several important ways. The victim was an elderly man who lived alone on the outskirts of town, someone who seemed an unlikely target for the killer who had previously focused on younger victims. However, the crime bore all the hallmarks of Pekalski's work, including the prolonged torture and elaborate ritualistic elements that had become his signature. What made this case particularly significant was that it provided the first real breakthrough in the investigation. A neighbor reported seeing a suspicious figure near the victim's home on the night of the murder, and the description they provided matched similar reports from the scenes of previous crimes. More importantly, the killer had made a crucial mistake. He had left behind a piece of physical evidence that would eventually lead to his identification and capture. The evidence in question was a cigarette butt found near the victim's body, something that seemed insignificant at first, but would prove to be the key to solving the case. While DNA analysis was not yet widely available in Poland, the cigarette could be tested for blood type and other markers that would help narrow down the suspect pool. More importantly, it suggested that the killer was becoming careless, perhaps overconfident in his ability to evade detection. As winter approached, the investigation was gaining momentum even as public fear continued to escalate. The police had established patterns in the killer's behavior and were beginning to develop a psychological profile that would guide their search. They knew they were looking for a local man, probably in his 20s or 30s, who had a history of antisocial behavior and who possessed detailed knowledge of the area where the crimes were occurring. Unknown to the investigators, Pekalski was already planning what he intended to be his most ambitious crime yet. The success of his previous murders had convinced him that he was untouchable, and he was eager to attempt something that would surpass even his own previous acts of brutality. This overconfidence would ultimately prove to be his undoing, as it would lead him to take risks that would finally provide police with the evidence they needed to identify and capture him. The stage was now set for the final act in Leszek Pekalski's reign of terror. His crimes had terrorized an entire region, claimed multiple innocent lives, and pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to their absolute limits. But his luck was about to run out, and the investigation that had struggled for so long to identify him was finally closing in on its target. The monster who had stalked the streets of northern Poland for nearly 2 years was about to face justice for his unspeakable crimes. The winter of 1992 brought with it an intensified police effort that would ultimately lead to Leszek Pekalski's downfall. The task force investigating the serial murders had grown to include some of Poland's most experienced criminal investigators, and they were beginning to piece together a comprehensive picture of the killer they were pursuing. Advanced forensic techniques, recently introduced from Western countries, were being applied to the evidence collected from the crime scenes, yielding new insights that had previously been impossible to obtain. The breakthrough that investigators had been desperately seeking came from an unexpected source. A local bartender contacted police to report a customer who had been behaving strangely in recent months, making disturbing comments about the ongoing murders and displaying knowledge of details that had not been released to the public. The customer in question was Leszek Pekalski, who had apparently become so comfortable with his perceived invincibility that he had begun to let his guard down in social situations. According to the bartender's statement, Pekalski had made several visits to the establishment in the weeks following each murder, always appearing agitated and talkative in a way that seemed completely out of character for the usually reserved man. During these visits, he would consume large quantities of alcohol and engage in rambling monologues about violence and death that made other patrons uncomfortable. Most damning of all, he had made specific references to the torture methods used in the murders, details that only the killer or someone with access to the investigation files would have known. Armed with this information, investigators began to focus their attention on Pekalski as their primary suspect. Surveillance was established, and his background was thoroughly investigated for the first time. What they discovered painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose entire life had been building toward the violent explosion that had terrorized the region for the past 2 years. The evidence against Pekalski began to accumulate rapidly once investigators knew where to look. The cigarette butt found at the 4th crime scene was tested and found to match his blood type. Witnesses who had been unable to provide clear descriptions previously were shown his photograph, and several made positive identifications. Most convincingly, a search of his various residences yielded physical evidence linking him directly to the crimes, including personal items that had belonged to the victims. On March 15, 1993, a team of heavily armed police officers surrounded the rundown apartment building where Pekalski was living under an assumed name. The arrest was carried out with extreme caution, as investigators were well aware of the suspect's capacity for violence and his potential desperation when cornered. However, Pekalski surrendered without resistance, almost seeming relieved that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. The initial interrogation of Leszek Pekalski proved to be as disturbing as investigators had anticipated. Rather than denying his involvement in the murders, he seemed almost eager to discuss them in detail, displaying a level of pride in his work that shocked even experienced officers who thought they had seen everything. His descriptions of the crimes were clinical and methodical, delivered with an emotional detachment that suggested a complete absence of remorse or empathy for his victims. What emerged from these early interviews was a picture of a killer who viewed his crimes not as acts of violence against human beings, but as artistic expressions of his own superiority and power. He spoke of his victims as if they were merely materials he had used to create something meaningful, showing no recognition that he had destroyed real lives and caused immeasurable suffering to their families and communities. This dehumanization of his victims was so complete that it bordered on the pathological, suggesting severe mental illness alongside his criminal behavior. The legal proceedings against Pekalski would prove to be complex and controversial. Poland's legal system was still adapting to the post-communist era, and there were questions about how to handle a case of this magnitude and complexity. The death penalty had been abolished, meaning that the maximum sentence Pekalski could receive was life imprisonment, a fact that generated considerable public debate about whether justice could truly be served under these circumstances. The trial itself became a media sensation, with journalists from across Poland and beyond descending on the small courthouse where proceedings were held. The public's fascination with the case was matched only by their revulsion at the details that emerged during testimony. Families of the victims attended the proceedings, seeking some form of closure while being forced to relive the worst moments of their lives as evidence was presented in excruciating detail. Pekalski's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his own statements had provided investigators with detailed confessions to all of the crimes with which he was charged. Their strategy ultimately focused on arguing that Pekalski was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for his actions, a line of reasoning that required extensive psychological evaluation and expert testimony. The psychiatric assessments of Pekalski revealed a complex and disturbing psychological profile. Multiple experts examined him over the course of several months, employing a variety of tests and interview techniques to understand the mind of someone capable of such extreme violence. What they discovered was an individual who exhibited characteristics of several different personality disorders, combined with possible organic brain damage that may have contributed to his lack of impulse control and empathy. However, the question of whether Pekalski's mental illness absolved him of legal responsibility for his crimes proved to be contentious. While experts agreed that he suffered from significant psychological disorders, there was disagreement about whether these conditions had rendered him incapable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. The prosecution argued successfully that his careful planning and attempts to avoid detection demonstrated that he knew his behavior was wrong and illegal, regardless of his mental state. The victims' families played a crucial role in the proceedings, providing impact statements that helped the court understand the full scope of the damage Pekalski had inflicted. Their testimony was heartbreaking, describing not only the immediate loss of their loved ones, but the ongoing trauma that continued to affect their lives years after the murders. Many spoke of their inability to trust others, their persistent fear for their own safety, and their struggle to find meaning in a world where such evil could exist. On November 12, 1993, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against Leszek Pekalski. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Polish law. The courtroom erupted in applause from the victims' families and supporters, while Pekalski himself showed no visible reaction to the verdict. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for final statements from both the prosecution and defense. The prosecutor's closing argument summarized the horrific nature of Pekalski's crimes and emphasized the need to protect society from individuals capable of such extreme violence. The defense made a final plea for leniency based on their client's mental illness, but their arguments had little impact on a judge and jury who had been confronted with overwhelming evidence of premeditated brutality. Pekalski was transferred to a maximum security prison where he would spend the remainder of his life. His cell was specially monitored due to concerns about both his potential for violence against other inmates and the odds possibility that he might attempt suicide. Prison officials were also concerned about the possibility that he might try to communicate with potential followers or imitators, leading to strict limitations on his contact with the outside world. In the years following his conviction, Pekalski became the subject of numerous studies by criminologists and psychologists seeking to understand the factors that had contributed to his transformation into a serial killer. His case was used as a teaching tool in law enforcement academies and university criminology programs, helping future investigators recognize the warning signs of similar individuals before they could claim more victims. The impact of Pekalski's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The entire region where he had operated experienced lasting changes in behavior and attitudes, with increased security measures becoming a permanent part of daily life. Parents became more protective of their children. Women altered their routines to avoid potentially dangerous situations, and the general sense of safety and security that had characterized the area was permanently shattered. The case also had significant implications for Polish law enforcement and criminal justice procedures. The investigation had revealed serious deficiencies in crime scene processing, evidence handling, and interagency communication that had potentially allowed Pekalski to continue killing longer than might have been necessary. These lessons led to important reforms in police training and procedures that would benefit future investigations. Today, more than 3 decades after his crimes terrorized northern Poland, Leszek Pekalski remains imprisoned, serving his life sentence with no possibility of release. He has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, but he has largely refused to grant interviews or provide additional information about his crimes. His name has become synonymous with evil in Polish popular culture, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary individuals. The victims of his crimes are remembered not as statistics in a criminal case, but as human beings whose lives were cut short by an individual who had surrendered completely to his basest impulses. Their families continue to live with the aftermath of his violence, carrying scars that will never fully heal, but finding ways to honor the memory of their loved ones and to ensure that their deaths were not completely meaningless. The story of Leszek Pekalski serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would prey upon the innocent. It is a tale of horror and tragedy, but also of the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up and the resilience of a community that refused to be destroyed by fear. In the end, justice was served, but the cost was paid by victims who deserved so much better than the fate that befell them at the hands of one of Poland's most notorious killers.